Well, good morning. Glad you're here this morning. And as we continue this series, we kind of wrap this up today. This is the last week. I don't know if you have that person in your life. Like, if you ever had that person that you just love being in their presence. I don't know if you have this person where it's like you could spend all day, all night, like just all the time with this person. And maybe it's a spouse, maybe it's a friend, maybe it's like a mentor. If you ever had that kind of person where like you just love being in their presence, something about them calms you down, something about them like makes you just feel at home or comfortable or at peace. There's something about that person. I don't know if you have that kind of person in your life. I remember a few years ago, I was pretty young, and I was starting out kind of in ministry. I'd be working at this church that was a smaller church, church of 250, 300 people, something like that. And I got moved from that church, and God kind of moved us out to Washington State to work at another church. And I was working in a much larger church. And I remember getting there, and I showed up to work, my very first day of work, and I had gone from a staff of about 4 to a staff of about 70. And I had moved from a budget of about like a church budget of, I don't know, $150,000, $200,000 to a church budget of like $3 million. My job was much bigger, and there was much more resource. It was a huge building. There was so much going on. Like, it just was overwhelming. I remember my first day there, they're walking me through all these things. I don't know if you ever had a job change like this where you go from like the mom and pop to like the big dogs, and all of a sudden there's all these policies and procedures, and they walk you through all the policies and procedures. Here's how you lock up. Here's how you check in. Here's how you time clock. Here's how whatever it might be that you have. And you have all these, policies, procedures, all these manuals and booklets. Here's your employee manual. Do you want to sign up for the 401k? I mean, just all the things, right? And it's his first day, and I just felt so overwhelmed. Like, I just felt over the top, like scared and overwhelmed. And to be honest with you, I felt a little bit, not just overwhelmed, I felt a little bit insufficient. Like, there was a part of me that was like, maybe I bit off more than I could chew. Maybe this is a bad idea, right? There's a little bit that felt like insufficient. There's a little bit that felt like I was just in the wrong spot. Like, I felt terrified. I felt scared. I felt like I was just overwhelmed on every level. Marie came to the office, and she brought me lunch. And she just walked in, and immediately she saw in my eyes, she was like, "Oh, you're not okay, are you?" And I was like, "No, I'm not. Like, I don't know what's going on. There's so much happening." And I remember saying, like, I might have overdone it here. This might be more than I can handle. And she said, "Well, just get through the day. We'll talk about it later." And I went into my next meeting, and my next meeting was with my supervisor. And my supervisor, his name was Randy. Randy was a professional family licensed mental health and family counselor, which was fantastic for me because, man, I need nothing more than that. And I just sat down in his office. I remember immediately just sitting down with him, and you could just kind of feel that weight come off the shoulders. I don't know if you ever do you have somebody like this in your life? You just kind of sit down with him, and you're like, oh man, like everything just kind of felt better. And he starts talking to me, and as we're talking, he's asking questions, and they're good questions, and he's digging deep into things, but at the same time not making me feel intimidated by any means. And we start talking about the job and how I'm feeling overwhelmed, but instead of like doing anything in that meeting, we did not accomplish almost anything in that meeting except for the fact that my heart rate slowed down. Right? Like, I didn't have a heart attack. Something. I felt like I was like a human again. I felt like I could do the job I was being asked to do. I felt like I was no longer overwhelmed. I was no longer insufficient. I was no longer like insecure about this. I felt like suddenly I could do what I was being asked to do. I felt like that changed me. And I walked out of that meeting afterwards, and I had a couple more meetings, and then I left for home. And I got home, and Marie was like, "Man, you seem so much better." And she's like, "What happened?" And I was like, "Well, I got some time with Randy." And she was like, "Tell me more about Randy." And I was like, "I don't know. He was great. He was like, it was amazing. It was like the best day of my life. I just sat down with Randy. We talked for an hour. I felt so much better. Everything was great." And from that time on at that church, and even to this day, I still call Randy occasionally. But even at times at that church, I changed supervisors multiple times. And I said, "But I still want every week a time on my calendar with Randy, because you won't like me without Randy. Like, you won't like me if I don't have this time with Randy." Now, there's something about this. I don't know if you have somebody like this in your life. Maybe it's a parent. Maybe it's a friend. Maybe it's somebody you go to like this. And being with them actually changes us. Anybody have that person? Like, being with that person changes me. Being with him changed me. Being with Randy changed me. Being with other people, it changes you. And sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. But being around that is such a good thing for us. And in this like passage and what we're talking about today, really the idea of being around those people and having that change us. In the New Testament language, that's the word transformation. That's, if you're not familiar with this, transformation, right? You're changing from who you were to who you're becoming. And I would argue that you're doing that no matter who you're hanging out with, no matter who you're around. There's that old saying, show me your friends and I'll show you your future, right? Like, you're changing all the time. You're constantly kind of changing towards the people that you're around. But I would just say that in the language of the New Testament, it's this transformation that's going to take place. And we're going to transform who we are. Now, when we look at this passage, if you've been in this series with us at all, you know there's kind of a couple things going on here. We've been looking at the 7 statements in the book of John where Jesus says, I am, and then he fills in a blank. He's using the words from Exodus where God says, I am who I am, but Jesus is taking what God says in Exodus and he's building upon it, saying, that's God and I am God incarnate. Let me tell you who I am. Let me give you more descriptive adjectives to understand who I am. He's building upon this language that God has set forth. And as he's doing that, there's 7 different statements in the book of John where he does this. And if you remember, every single time we have this happen, we run into this thing where there's a statement and there's a sign, and the two are connected. So there's usually a sign, meaning like a miracle. As in our words, we would call it a miracle. John never calls it a miracle in his gospel, in his biography. He never calls them miracles. He calls them signs, saying this is a sign that this is the Messiah. This is a sign this is the same God who is I am, who is now with us. And so he's saying this is a sign that you need to see. And there's a sign and there's a statement. And almost every miracle, that's the way it goes. Jesus performs a miracle, and then he goes, let me tell you who I am because of that miracle. There's a sign, then there's a statement. But this one doesn't have that. This one's very confusing. And so what we see here is when we look at John chapter 15, notice what he says. He says, I am the true vine. My Father is the gardener. Okay, that's what he gives us. But if you notice in this passage, and if you look and you have your Bible open, we'll be in John 15 the whole time. But in John 15, there are no miracles happening around this passage. There's nothing there. In fact, this is what would be called the upper room discourse, which is the last 7 chapters of John, where John kind of takes on all of what Jesus does, and he takes those pieces in the upper room where it's the Last Supper, the foot washing and communion, and then he kind of like takes on the end of Jesus' life. But those last 7 chapters are kind of the last few hours of Jesus' earthly life. That's what he focuses on. And so this isn't a part where there's a miracle. This is kind of just the end of Jesus' life. And in the end of Jesus' life, towards the end of it, this is what Jesus stops and says, I am the true vine. My Father is the gardener. There's no miracle attached. And maybe that's because this is Jesus' last statement, but what most people believe is that Jesus does have a miracle attached to this. It's just not the one you'd expect. The miracle attached to this is not here at the end of the story, but it's actually back at the beginning. This isn't the last statement. This is actually in the first miracle, the first sign that Jesus performs. If you know what that is, in the book of John, it's a story that you would not expect to be Jesus' first miracle. It's not the coolest or the most exciting miracle he performs, but it's in John chapter 2. And I'm just going to walk you through the beats of this story because this is crazy. This is the story. You know the story, but let me walk you through the story because it's a weird, weird story. It says in John chapter 2, this is the miracle, the sign. On the 3rd day, now I just want you to catch what John's doing here, by the way. For this miracle. Notice what he starts with. On the 3rd day. Why is that important? We're not keeping calendars. John's alluding to a bigger story that's going on here. There are bigger signs, bigger miracles. John's setting us up for these are the signs to come. Look for them. The 3rd day, that's when Jesus is resurrected. The 3rd day has everything to do with that. John's not worried about the calendar. Notice he doesn't say like on the 3rd day of what month or the 3rd day of what year. He doesn't care. It's the 3rd day. It's a sign. He's showing us something else. He says, on the 3rd day, a wedding took place. Something Jesus shows up to, apparently, at Cana in Galilee. Now, if you know anything about Cana, you would know that Cana is not a place you would know. Cana is not a big city. It is not a big town. The fact that Jesus goes there, it's kind of like, I would imagine, I could be wrong with this, I imagine it's with like, what's that place, Thono-Tasasa? I drive by a place, everybody see that sign? You know the place I'm talking about? You know the sign, right? You've heard of it. Anybody know what it is? No, I don't think it's a real place. I don't think that's a real thing. I think somebody had a misspelling on a sign and just didn't want to go back to fix it. And they were just like, just leave it. Nobody knows if it exists or not. The same type of thing. It's like Gonzaga University. You have no idea if that's real, do you? You don't know. You just assume it is. You see them in the NCAA tournament, you're like, I guess there's a place called Gonzaga. There's probably not. They just made that up. So this is like what this is, right? It's like this place in the middle of nowhere. The fact that Jesus goes to a wedding there is so insignificant. Like, it's such a weird thing. He's in the middle of nowhere at this wedding of people we don't even know. These aren't even like famous people. These aren't people that you would pay attention to. They never name who they are. This is a wedding that should not matter, completely insignificant. And while they're there, Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. So he brings all of his Talmudim, as would be the word, all the disciples, the better word for them is apprentices, who are learning the way of Jesus. They come with him. And they're there as they learn how Jesus lives. Then it says, when the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, they have no more wine, which is... This is a pretty self-explanatory sentence. Now, some of us are like, I'm just gonna put it out there. If you were to think of Jesus' first miracle, what would you think? This is a guy, I'm just saying, like, this is a guy who's come from heaven to earth to show the way, from the earth to the cross, my debt to pay, right? Like, this is what he's supposed to do. And you were to think, if this is what he's going to be, what would you think the first miracle should be about? I'm just going to ask you, like, what would you think? I would think a dead guy should be raised up, or like at least a deaf guy should get his hearing back, or a guy who's lame should be walking. And Mary sees this and says, you know what the first miracle needs to be is we got a real problem. Not one of those small problems. The real problem we got here is we're out of wine. And some of you are like, I understand that. Like, and we need to talk about that later. But anyway, it's like some of you are like, I get it, right? Oh, man, that's a real issue, right? And she comes and she says, and notice what they have this back and forth. I kind of love this back and forth. And Jesus says, woman, which wouldn't advise talking to your mother this way, why do you involve me? Jesus says, my hour has not yet come. I imagine this is beneath his pay grade, right? Like, this is not what he came to do. This isn't exciting. This isn't what we would think of a Messiah coming to do. This is beneath his pay grade. Like, I was just the other day talking to a woman that I work with, and I was chatting with her, and she works in our refugee service. She brings in refugees from all over the world, helps them kind of legally and safely immigrate into our country, mostly from Afghanistan right now, but from other countries that are kind of war-torn and stuff. And I asked her, I said, how did you get into this? And she said, well, and she told me, she said, Kevin, I'm only clerical. I work very low. I'm not very high up. And I said, well, that's, I said, I get it. And I asked her to do a couple favors for me, just a couple things I needed done around that office. And she was like, I'm happy to do that. And at one point, I realized, I said, what did you do before you moved here, Malala? And she said, well, I was an air traffic controller. I was like, holy, okay. I should probably ask you to do more important things. I think that's where Jesus is at. Is like, hey, like I do more than this. The wine is not the biggest issue, right? It's not my time. My time hasn't yet come. But I love this. Jesus says it has not come. And notice this. Mary doesn't even talk back to Jesus. I love Mary. Mary, she was like a feisty little Jewish woman. I love this. And she said, his mother doesn't even say anything to Jesus. She just speaks to the servants and says, do whatever he tells you. Just do. Like, I'm not having this fight with you right now. We're not doing this, son. She puts him in his place. Just do whatever he tells you. Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding 20 to 30 gallons. Some people believe that there's 6 here because it's an incomplete number. We're not seeing the final sign. This is not the final sign. 7 would be a number of completion. 6 is a number of incompletion, knowing that we're not there yet. And so there's like this idea that we're not quite there where we want to be yet. This isn't the final sign. This is just the beginning. And Jesus says to the servants, fill the jars with water. So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine, and he did not realize where it had come from, though the servants knew who had drawn the water. That had drawn the water, they knew. And when he called the bridegroom aside, it said, everyone brings out the choice wine first, then the cheaper wine as the guests have had too much to drink. But you saved the best till now, which is a great money-saving technique that we've all used. Like, this is the part of the Bible where we're like, this is very relatable. This is a verse to live by. Save the cheap stuff for later. What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs. Was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Those that were following him, they saw something in this sign that was intriguing to them. Now, Jesus doesn't say an I am statement here. He doesn't make an I am statement. But they see a sign here, and they start to believe. The people who are following him, they see what is possible. Again, if I was to ask you what Jesus' first miracle would be, I don't think that any of us would say probably the most important thing Jesus could do to set himself apart is turn water into wine. It's not a crucial thing. It's not life-changing or life-altering. It's not life-saving. It's just turning water into wine. So what's the point of this story? So, why is this the first miracle? Why is it that they see this and the disciples see this and they believe? And they're like, we're part of this. We want to be part of this. My guess is that what they see there is something that maybe you and I see as well. Is that with Jesus, there is this transformation that is possible. He transforms something from one thing to the other. He makes one thing into something else. He transforms them. I'm going to guess that if you're here today for whatever reason, that there's probably something in you that has seen something in Jesus where you're like, I want to be more like that. When I'm with him or when I see what he does, I want more of that. Maybe it's like peace. Maybe it's just you see Jesus. I love the fact that when I see Jesus, I see him as just this peaceful person that seems to have things figured out in his life. And every time I think like I'm 40 now and I thought by 40 I should have things figured out. I also thought that when I was 30. That by 30 you have things figured out, and because you saw your parents and you thought, well, they probably have it figured out, and now you're realizing nobody's got it figured out. We're all just treading water here, aren't we? Right? And you see Jesus, he has this piece of just he's got it figured out. He's not worried about what you think. He's not worried about the world thinks. He's not worried about trying to impress anybody. He knows exactly who he is and why he's here. There's no secret about it. He's so at peace with that. There's something about that is attractive to us. I think we want to be more like that. Maybe you see Jesus as a person who's just kind. There's things he does that are just he does good stuff for the world. And there's part of us that is attracted to that. I want to be like that. I want to do things that help people. There's an altruistic motive to this, right? Maybe you see Jesus and you're like, I want to be more like Jesus because he is so wise, because he is so intelligent, because of the way he teaches, whatever it might be. There's usually something that attracts us to and makes us want to transform to be more like Jesus. We want that. I don't think you're here today if you don't want to be more like Jesus. I'm going to guess that there's something in his character and who he is that you want to be more like. I'm going to guess. And his disciples see that this transformation is possible. But Jesus is going to tell us how. How is it possible? Just like wine is created, right? Wine, he takes water and he turns it into wine. I don't know if you know how wine works. Maybe I should just clarify this really quickly. It comes from what they would call the vine. Wine comes from grapes. Grapes grow on a vine. I don't know if I needed to spell this out, but here we are. It comes from grapes. Grapes come from a vine. That's why he's saying that he is actually this true vine, this water that's been turned into wine, this thing that has been transformed from one thing to the other. And how do you do that? Maybe you're like me and you're like, how? How do I go about that? Now, this is where you would expect that what I would tell you is, here's how you do it. Is step one is you just pray a lot more. It's prayer, it's just constant prayer and Bible study, and that's how you're going to transform. I'm not saying that's bad. Don't hear me wrong. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying that you would expect that's where we're going to go. That's what Jesus is going to tell us. Or you would think that what Jesus is going to tell us is the thing we need to do more is worship. We need to come together. We need to be in church more. We need to worship more. You need to worship harder. I've read those books. I don't know if you have, of if you just worshiped the right way, kind of God would do whatever you wanted. That's kind of how it works. Or maybe you're hearing, this is a common one, is you're like, well, this is where we talk about giving. I need to give up financially, or I need to give more. That's how God's going to transform me, is I need to give to his kingdom, and then he transforms me through that. I'm not saying any of those are necessarily bad, but I want you to see what Jesus tells us is the way for transformation. If he's the vine, what do we do? And in John 15, let me just read this passage for you. Back in John 15, verse 1. He says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. Verse 2, he cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, so that it will be even more fruitful. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. And here we start, verse 4. Remain in me, as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. Verse 5, I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If you do not remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up and thrown into the fire and burned. If you remain in me, and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. This is for my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. This word, I don't know if you caught it, there's a word that seems to happen over and over again. It's the word remain. In fact, in the passage that Aaron read for us a second ago, you can find the word remain 11 times in just a few verses. It seems like there's something that Jesus is trying to drive home here. A remain. Now, this is the word meno in Greek. This is what it means. And so it's this word that, yes, it means to stay, right? To just kind of stay put. It means to abide, sometimes you've heard that word maybe, abide in me and I will abide in you. Means to dwell or remain or to even stand, like just to kind of stay put. And where do you stand? Is it REM that taught us that you stand in the place where you live? Is that right? Was it REM that sang that? Okay, Brad's nodding his head. I think it was, stand in the place where you live. So make your home is actually what it means. It literally is a word that people would use for homemaking. Like, this is what you do. This is where you live. This is where you do your life, is in this place. You remain here. This is what it looks like. We stay here in this same place. We abide. And so what's interesting is it's not about action. It's about abiding. It's about staying put. I think most of us, what we think is how we're going to transform is we're going to try harder. We're going to do more. We're going to act on more things. That's how we transform. We transform by more work and more action. That's not what Jesus is saying here. You transform not by action, but by abiding. It's not an action-oriented thing. It's by abiding in him, by being with him. One of my favorite examples of this is in the 15th century, there was a guy, he wrote a book. You can find it. It's a fantastic little book called Practicing the Presence of God. It's by a guy named Brother Lawrence. Brother Lawrence was a soldier in the medieval time of the 15th century, and he was a soldier, and he left after being a soldier. He went to a monastery and said, "I'd like to be a monk." But when he went to the monastery, he didn't decide that he was going to try to become a priest or become some kind of even a deacon. He decided he wanted to be a dishwasher. And Brother Lawrence became famous for being a dishwasher. People would come from all over the world to talk to Brother Lawrence, to learn from him about what he was doing, because he was so good at practicing the presence of God in what he did on a day-to-day basis. I love this quote from his book. Again, if you want to read it, it's very short. But he says this: "The time of busyness for me," I want you to see what happens here. "The time of busyness does not with me differ from the time of prayer." Now, how many of you is that true? I'm just going to ask. Your busiest times, when you are overworked, when you are, in his case, washing the dishes, when you are doing all the work, how often does it feel like you are abiding just as much then as you are in the time of prayer? For me, they feel like radically different things. If I look at my meeting agenda on a Monday, and for me, Mondays are just meetings from 8:30 to 5:30, just nonstop meetings. And I look at that day, I'm just going to be honest with you, that time from 8:30 to 5:30 does not feel anything like my time in prayer. Abiding looks very different. Brother Lawrence says that he's learned this secret to it. The time of busyness does not differ from the time of prayer. And in the noise, in the clatter of my kitchen, while several persons are at the same time calling for different things, anybody relate to this, by the way? Like anybody, I don't know, moms or anything, like where like just your family, your life is like revolving around you at this moment? Anybody feel like this is like your daily life? Or like any of you in the office feel like this is happening, where you have employees and just contracts, whoever you're working with, that need all these different things? They do not, all these things are happening, and I possess God as great in tranquility, in that time that's quiet, as if I were upon my knees before the blessed sacrament. I mean, like for him, that's actually the time where he would take communion every day. In communion, he felt just as close to God as he did in all the work he was doing. So what's interesting to me is I think abiding looks different than we expect. It's not that God wants you to not do what you're doing. It's that he wants you to do what you're doing while abiding in him. Does that make sense? It's not that you don't do what you're doing. You do those things while abiding in him. They are not separate things. In our world, I think we like to compartmentalize these things. I do my work here, and I do my God stuff here. That's how it works. Never the twain shall meet. I don't need those two getting intersected and getting all mucked up, right? I like it when I eat my food in the right places where it's I don't know, anybody this kind of eater where you don't like if your foods touch, right? Where you're like, oh, those better not get in the way of each other. We do not touch those foods together. Anybody that kind of person? That's like the way I think we see our time with God and our time in work or with others. We don't see them as overlapping or intersecting. We see them as radically different pieces. And what I love about what he's saying here is abiding is not an action where we fully step out of the things we're doing. In fact, it's actually a way of being in two places at the same time. Abiding is being in two places at the same time. It's doing the work we're called to do, the things that we're called to do in the way that we're supposed to do them, while still being in communion with God at the same time. It's having a foot in both worlds, being able to see both at the same time. I had a guy in my life who reminded me a lot of Brother Lawrence. Brother Lawrence, by the way, doesn't that just sound like a guy that maybe I don't know if you grew up in church like I did, but going to church, you would have a guy in your church named Brother Lawrence, right? But for me, I had a guy in my church. His name was not Brother Lawrence. His name was Tom Perkins. And I remember Tom Perkins, I went to when we were in Casper, Wyoming, which is, again, it is a real place, not like a lot of people there. But we went to, my dad moved us out there when I was 7 years old and decided that we should live in Casper, Wyoming. We had moved from Daytona Beach, Florida, the heart of spring break in the 90s, to Casper, Wyoming, which is not the heart of anything. So we got there. It does have really good, I don't know, antelope hunting probably or something, but it's not a place like that. And we got there, and we went to this church, and this church that he was working at was actually a very large church for a very small town. The town was about 50,000 people. The church that he was working at was about 2,000 of those 50,000. And so we got there, and we went to this church, and I remember it was this big old church. It had formerly been a service merchandise, if anybody remembers service merchandise. Anybody remember those? Kind of like a Circuit City situation. It had been one of those. They had converted it into a church building because it was just so large. And it had gymnasiums in it. It had multiple different theaters in it. Had tons of classrooms. It was a beautiful, just huge facility. Really, really cool spot. And there was one man whose job it was to keep up that whole building, right? His job was to be the janitor of that building. And the janitor, his name was Tom. And Tom Perkins was our janitor. And I remember learning as I was there, the senior pastor, his name was John Spear. John, one day I was in the church, and I was there all the time, just constantly just kind of hanging out in this building. And I saw Tom, and I said hi to Tom. Thank you for, he was just there, and I kind of just saw him. And I watched our senior pastor go over to him. It was in the middle of a day, on a Wednesday, and Tom is just cleaning out inside the sanctuary, just cleaning the pews. And I watched our pastor go over to Tom, start talking to Tom, thank Tom so much for what he was doing. Just thank him over and over again for what he was doing. And then I watched our pastor sit down in the pew, and I watched Tom start praying over our pastor. And this went on for about 20 minutes, where he's praying over our pastor. So it was very interesting. This custodian who's in the church is praying over our pastor. I'm just saying it's interesting. You don't see that very often. And then I watched as our senior pastor left. A few minutes later, I watched as our small groups pastor, she came in. And she started talking to Tom as he's cleaning. Before I know it, she's sitting down in a pew, and Tom is praying over her. And it seemed like just a non-ending cycle from there on, just people coming in, getting prayed for by Tom. And what I found out, I asked my dad about it. I said, Tom was praying for all these different people today. And he said, yeah, what I've learned since being here is that Tom is the secret sauce of this church. I was like, because he's really good at cleaning? It turns out that's not what it was for. Tom had left his job that he had worked before where he was getting paid pretty well because he wanted to be a janitor at the church because he wanted to be in the house of the Lord all day. And he wanted to be able to just be there and pray and pray and pray and never have to stop feeling that he was out of the presence of God. Just pray over the church while he was there all day. And he prayed for the church all day, every day while he was there. That's why he took the job. Now, what's interesting is he continued to clean the building. He had a job. His job was to clean the building, and he did that. That wasn't out of the question. But he constantly prayed over that church. And I remember pastors telling me he was the secret sauce of that church. He was the one that kept it going. Tom passed away a few years ago, and I can't tell you how many thousands of people, not just from that little town, but from all over Wyoming and that area came, and how many pastors sat in that room to come to Tom's funeral because of what he had done in their lives. As a guy who had one foot in cleaning a church and another foot in abiding in the presence of God, practicing the presence of God. And if you meet a person like that, have you ever met a person like that? Oh man, it messes with you. Because you're like, how do I get that? Whatever that is, that presence of God that you have with you. Like he was practicing the presence. See, it's not like an action thing. It's not more action. It's not more activity. It's doing the action you're doing while abiding in God. It's not adding to, it's not adding something else to it. That's not the goal of this. The goal is that we would constantly be actively in the presence of God while we're doing what we're doing. In fact, God says that if we continue to do the things we're doing without him, notice what verse 5 says. Verse 5, it says, I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do what? Nothing. Which is a real vote of confidence from Jesus here. You can do nothing apart from me. It's being in two places at once, doing the thing you're supposed to do, doing the thing that you've been called to do, while being in the presence of God, because you need both to be able to accomplish anything. And for me, I'll be honest with you, this is where I struggle. This is where I struggle. I don't know about you, but I have a really hard time with this. Like, I'm bad at practicing just the presence of God. I would say I'm much better at practicing the way of Jesus. Let me just do the things that I'm supposed to do. Let me check the boxes. Anybody else like this? Maybe you come from like a background that's a little bit more like ritualistic. Maybe you come from like a more conservative or Catholic background, something like that, where it's a little bit more like we have the boxes, we check, and then we kind of move through this. I have a lot of that in me, where I'd rather just get through the things I'm supposed to do, not just remain in the presence of God. And you know why I think I like that more? You know why? And this is really maybe too vulnerable or too honest. I think I like that version more because I'm a real prideful person. And I think somehow inside of me that God needs that from me. Like sometimes you think like I need to give to God. I need to give him financially. I need to give, or I need to pray more, or I need to worship more, or whatever. Because God needs that from me. And you know, one of the best like things I've ever learned in my walk with Jesus is that Jesus needs nothing from me. Like he doesn't need anything. Like God doesn't need your money. I don't know how to break this to you. God's not poor. He's doing just fine. He doesn't need your money. That's not what he's asking for. Like he doesn't need your worship. He's not a narcissist. He doesn't need your prayer. God's not lonely. Like just out there just like, please somebody talk to me. God's not that guy. That's not who he is. But he wants these things for us. It's not that he wants things from us. He wants things for us. And the reason we do give to him is to remind us that, yeah, God's not poor, but I do give. Why? Because I need to remind myself that money is not God. And therefore I give to remind myself who God is. I don't worship because God needs my worship. I worship because it reminds me how small I am and how great he is. I don't pray because God needs my prayers. I pray because I am then connected to the ultimate source of truth and love in the universe. Like I am connected to him directly. I'm abiding in him. That's how this works. And I think part of me is so prideful that I'm like, he should want this from me. At the end of the day, that's not what he wants from us. It's what he wants for us. He wants this to happen for us. It's not action. It's more abiding. Dallas Willard kind of points this out and says this is how we move from this piece of action. I love this. It's a long quote, I apologize, but he says this: the first and most basic thing we can and must do, is keep God before our minds. We have to keep him first and foremost. This is the fundamental secret of caring for our souls. Our part in thus, notice this is Brother Lawrence language, and he's stealing it directly. Our part in thus practicing the presence of God is to direct and redirect our minds constantly to him. So you're doing what you're doing, and you're constantly redirecting your mind to him. In the early time of our practicing, we may be challenged by our burdensome habits of dwelling on things less than God. This is what we dwell on. And this is why abiding is so hard for us, is because we constantly dwell on things less than God. That's where our minds go. Anything less than. But what if you were able to both do the work you're called to do, which is less than God, and still remain in the presence of God, understanding that he is bigger than that, having the foot in both worlds? The good news is these are just habits. These are not the law of gravity, and they can be broken. When we continue to think that way, it can be changed. A new grace-filled habit will replace the former ones as we take intentional steps toward keeping God before us. Soon our minds will return to God as the needle of a compass constantly returns to north. If God is the great longing of our souls, he will become the pole star of our inward beings. If we continue to redirect our minds, if we continue to change that and we abide in him, it will eventually start to happen. I believe this. This is the practice of the presence. We continually redirect our minds. We continually put him back in the forefront of our minds. We see him as the center of all things. When we do that, eventually our minds will be redirected, and we will find ourselves abiding in him while we are doing the other things we're called to do, while we are in the middle of the things that we are supposed to do. Can you imagine what it'd be like if you were able to both be practicing the presence of God and doing your taxes? What would it feel like if you were able to practice the presence of God while you were doing the work that you're already doing? What if I'm just being honest, in this room, what if you were practicing the presence of God, if you were able to do that while you were meeting with people, while you were in meetings with people? Well, if you were practicing the presence of God while you are on a Zoom meeting, if you were practicing the presence of God while you are marketing things, or you're practicing the presence of God while you're driving a bus for kids, while you're practicing the presence of God while you're practicing law, practicing the presence of God while you're in IT, whatever it is, if you were able to practice the presence of God while you're doing these things, can you imagine that? That you'd have a foot in both worlds, and what that would change in the way that you do the work you're called to do, because you're practicing the presence of God, because you're abiding in what he's called you to do. Now, let's get a little practical with this, if that's okay. And I'm sorry, I know that we're not supposed to talk about how this goes, but let's try to kind of just break this down for a second. There's a few steps to this, because Mother Teresa, in a conversation one time, Mother Teresa was speaking to Henry Nouwen, which I would have, to be a fly on the wall of that conversation would have been amazing. But this is what she told him. He asked her, "How do I live a good life?" And Mother Teresa said this: "Spend 1 hour a day in adoration of your Lord, and never do anything that you know is wrong." That was it. That was the whole advice. An hour a day, not just in prayer, but in adoration of your Lord. How does it look? What does this do for us? A few things. So if I could just give you 3 things in how we practice the presence of God. First is place. I know that's a weird way to start. But place, finding the place that you practice the presence of God. And I will say, it probably will require finding a place that is separate from the place that you do other things. What's interesting, when Jesus tells us how to pray, in Matthew chapter 6, when Jesus tells us how to pray, notice what he starts with. He does not start with what to say. He starts with where to go. He starts with where you're at. And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand praying in the synagogues, on street corners, to be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they've received their reward in full. But then he goes on and he says, but when you pray, you need to go into your prayer closet, right? You need to go into your secret room, your own chambers. In fact, in the words he's using there is he's using a word in Greek, this tamion word, which means a storage chamber or a secret room. It's where you would hide your best stuff. Kind of like a safe. You would put it in the safe. He's saying, go into that part of your house, the innermost part of your house. Get away from everything else. Be in a secret place. That's where you need to have this. I love even more than that. Jesus doesn't just go into rooms to pray, but he goes out, right? The word eremos is what we see most frequently. We see it in Luke, right? In Luke chapter 5, when Jesus is out and it says, I love this verse. Notice these two verses go back to back. The news about him spread all the more. So Jesus is getting famous. And crowds came to hear him and to be healed of their sickness. But notice what Jesus does. He doesn't go to the crowds. Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. That word lonely places is that word eremos. Eremos means that it's a quiet place or a place of solitude. It's a place away from other people. The eremos is where he goes in this. And for some of us, that's where we need to go. So maybe it's every day finding a time. And I just would say this, before you put yourself on the tracks of your life, of being in the meetings or running people to school or doing the work that you've got to do that day, before we get ourselves into that, maybe we need to have a moment where we put our foot in the abiding part of us and we start to at least refocus ourselves first thing in the morning. This is why the Bible is so clear about spending time, especially first thing in the morning, to kind of get ourselves on that track of being with God. To be in two places at once, but to begin by being with God. And you need to find that place. Place is a big part of it. The second thing is persistence. We're not going to get there on the first try. You're not going to be able to both simultaneously live in the presence of God and do the work you've been called to do immediately. It's going to take some work. It's going to take persistence over and over and over again. You're going to have to keep doing this. Paul writes, right, that there is this thing in the world called the pattern of this world, right? Romans 12, where he says that there's this pattern that's happening in the world, that things are going to keep happening. It's going to move at its own pace, and you'll be lucky to keep up with it. You're just going to be part of that pace. You're going to fall into that pattern over and over again. But this persistence is to remind ourselves and take ourselves out of that pattern, to constantly be thinking, how can I abide at this moment to continue to do that? This is what we would see the idea of like just falling out of that pattern, being in our own wavelength, our own thought process. It's what Madame Goyon, who was a mystic in like the 16th century. I love the way she put this, but she called it the continuous inner act of abiding is the way she would call it. Like, this is different than the pattern of the world. This is your own thing. This is something that's going to be moving at its own pace. That's how she would put it. Or as Tozer would say, the habitual conscious communion. I love that one. Habitual conscious communion. That's what we're doing. We're constantly living in the presence and abiding in the presence of God. Or as Paul would write even, right? What does he say? Pray continually, like you're constantly running this in the back of your mind in 1 Thessalonians, right? You're just constantly running this in the back of your mind. This is how this is working. We constantly are living in the presence of God. It's not that easy. It's not going to be easy. I will say this. Every time we start to think of something that is less than God, we have to let it go. I remember I had a friend who was kind of a spiritual mentor, and he was telling me, I remember we were studying how to meditate. Anybody in this room ever like really meditated? It's a weird practice in some ways for Americans because we're so bad at sitting still and being quiet. Like, that's just not our MO. And I remember I was trying to get to the place where I could truly meditate on Scripture. And I'm only talking, this. I know this sounds very meager, but like I'm talking like being able to spend 10 full minutes of just complete silence, only meditating on Scripture, not thinking about anything else for 10 minutes. It's amazing when you really think about your thought processes. Do you know how long 10 minutes is? To be able to focus on one thing? Just so you know, in the most recent studies that have been done on the human brain, our attention span right now is about 6 seconds. A goldfish's attention span is 7 seconds. We're losing to goldfish. We're not doing good. 10 minutes, do you know how long that is to be able to meditate? And I know it doesn't sound long, but I want you to think about the last time that you really spent 10 minutes focused on anything by itself, just one thing for 10 minutes without having the interruptions of all the other things, right? And I was trying to do this and I was saying, like, how can I learn to just focus on Scripture, be able to meditate that way? And I believe in meditation. Let me just say this real quick. I believe meditation a lot of times is the listening side of prayer. So we're really good at the talking side of prayer. We like to talk at God. And I mean talk at God. We don't talk with God. We talk at God. We tell them a few things that we're like, we have to get the pleasantries out of the way. God, we're so, you're so cool and like you're really great and stuff, so that I can tell you, we butter them up a little bit so that I can tell them the laundry list of all the things that I need to get through. And then peace out, see you later. See you, I'll see you around, that kind of thing. And listening side of prayer is meditation, where we just sit in silence, we let God speak to us. And I was trying to get better at this. And I remember a friend gave me this piece of advice, and I'll give it to you. Maybe it's helpful, maybe it's not. But I remember him telling me that when you start to get distracted, and in the words of what Willard said, by anything less than God, when your mind starts to trail off in those things, he said, what you do is you just let it go. He said, see it like a stick in a stream. There's a stream that's moving in front of you, and there's a branch that's fallen in that stream. And you just let it go by. Just let it roll off. Don't worry about it. Don't try to chase it down. Don't try to pull that branch out of the stream. Don't try to find out more about the branch. Just let the branch go. And stay focused on what you're supposed to be focused on. I'll just say this, with the pattern of this world, it's moving like a stream all the time. There is a current underneath it that is constantly moving. And we will be swept up in it if we're not able to stand firm within it and abide or stand or make our home somewhere else. We will be swept up in it too. Let that just go and stay focused on the thing that you're supposed to be focused on. Anything less than God is the distraction. Third thing that I would say is just this, very simple, but just making it a priority. It's got to be a priority. It's got to be something we do. Ronald Rolheiser, who's a monk, once wrote this. He said that every choice is 1,000 renunciations. Every choice you make is 1,000 renunciations, meaning when you say yes to one thing, guess what? You're saying no to 1,000,000 others. When you say yes to one thing, it means you're going to have to get rid of some other things. And I'm just going to say this, and I'm not great at this myself. To learn to abide will not be something you just add into your daily routine. It will not be something you just add to what you're already doing. That's not what's happening here. Notice what Jesus talks about. Every branch that is not fruitful is actually taken away. This is not about addition, it's mostly about subtraction. By adding this in, it means that we will probably have to give up some other things. Both in our time, in our thoughts. We're going to have to give up some things that maybe we like, the part of us that some of the things we enjoy or we think that are good. They're not fruitful. They're going to go away. But also our time. It will take up some things in our time, and we will have to say no to 1,000 other renunciations in order to say yes to this one thing. Don't think this is just adding in one more thing to your day, or if I just wake up 1 hour earlier, it's all going to fall in place. It's saying no to a bunch of other things in order to say yes to the greater one. Anything less than God. My hope is that we as a church and as individuals, that we would practice the presence of God, that we would learn to truly abide in Him. Not just add more actions to it, but to truly just abide in His presence. To be able to be those kind of people. And that someday there would be people who tell stories about us, about you, and about me, that they would say, I met this person one time, and I was in this spot where I was overwhelmed, and I was feeling completely insignificant and insecure about what I was supposed to do. I wasn't sure where I was at. I didn't know what to do next. And I met this person who had this peace, who had this joy, who had felt like they had the presence of God with them, and it changed my life. My hope is we would be those people in the world, because the world doesn't have a lot of those people left. And we'd be able to have people tell that story about us someday, because we know what it feels like to practice the presence of God, even in the midst of what we're already doing. So this morning as we close, we're just going to sing for a second. And I just want to give us a second to just reflect and just give you a second to abide in this moment, to just be here, to remain in His presence at the moment. So if you would, let's stand together. And if you would, just if you would close your eyes for just a second, and just in the moments that you're in the thoughts that you have right now, would you just give yourself some space? I would encourage you just to try to clear your mind for just a second of all the other things. I know there's a million other things going on. And would you simply, I know this is really simple, but I believe that for the most part, God doesn't show up anywhere he's not asked to show up. He doesn't just show up. He doesn't force himself into our lives. Would you ask for God's presence in your life? Would you just ask him to show up in your life, even this week? Would you invite his presence into your life? However you want to do that, however you want to speak to him. Even if it's as simple as just saying, Jesus, I invite you in to my life. Invite you into my life. Jesus, we invite you into our homes. Jesus, we invite you into our businesses. Jesus, we invite you into our meetings. We invite you into our relationships. We invite you into our marriages. We want your presence there. We want to practice your presence on a day in, day out basis. In our conversations, in our thoughts. We want to invite your presence into the way we act, into the way that we do life, into the things that we care about, into the things that we don't care about, that we would invite you into those things today. I pray that as we practice your presence, that you would change us, that we would see true transformation that only comes from you. We thank you so much for your incredible love for us, that if we remain in you, that you promise that you'll remain with us. And that apart from you, we do nothing, but with you, we can do all the things. I pray that we be people who believe that and live in that every single day. We love you. We thank you for loving us. In Jesus' name, amen.